Hi, my name is David Boyke, and I'm going to show you how to build a simple directive for this jQuery knob library using AngularJS. I saw EvilTrout do a similar screencast where he did the exact same thing for EmberJS, and I thought it would be interesting to have an Angular example so that we could compare and contrast the two frameworks. Before we get started, just a note about my setup. Angular isn't as opinionated as Ember is about how to set up your solution, so if you're looking for a way to structure your project, I recommend the ng boilerplate solution, which you can find on GitHub, or there's also a Human plugin so that you can easily create a project that follows this structure. I've used Human right here, and this setup is really nice because it divides every single one of your little feature areas into folders with the JavaScript, styles, tests, and templates for each section right within a folder so that you're always working within the same space. But before we get started, we need to add jQuery knob to our solution. So we'll go to our command prompt and we'll type in bower install save jQuery knob. This will download the jQuery knob files along with jQuery, which is a dependency. Angular doesn't require jQuery as a dependency, but it will use it if it's present, and I prefer to do so most of the time. So if we go back to WebStorm and look in our vendor folder, we'll now see that we have jQuery and jQuery knob in here with files from those distributions inside. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tell our solution that we will be including these files in the finished product. So we'll go to our grunt file. Grunt is what is used to compile our application into a single JavaScript for deployment. So in this vendor section, we're going to add vendor jQuery distribution jQuery.js first because it needs to be loaded before AngularJS. And at the end, we'll add the script for our knob plugin. And these are just the paths that come from jQuery knob, and you will find these in the vendor folder if you go looking for them. The next thing we need to do is create a skeleton for our directive. So in an ng boilerplate solution, a great place to do this is the common directory. These are places to put things like directives that aren't really solution specific. So we can create a new folder. We'll call it knob. And inside it, we'll create a new file called knob.js. Now we need to add the boilerplate directive code. We're going to create an Angular module so that it's all self-contained within one module that could be easily portable to other projects. To get started, we start with Angular, and we declare a module, and we're going to call it knob, and we're going to say that it has no dependencies. And now we can use a fluent style to continue on and create a directive syntax. We'll call this knob as well, and it creates a function to get it created. And within this function, our job is to return an object that defines the directive for Angular. The first item is restrict, which tells Angular how to look for the directive. We can either say it will appear as an attribute by using an A. That's the default, but I always like to put it in just so that it's very clear. But in this case, we're going to use a capital E to say that this is going to show up as an element, an actual HTML element. In fact, we're basically inventing HTML right now. And then the other thing that's necessary in our case is a link function. And this takes the parameters scope, which is the Angular object that kind of acts as your view model, and the element itself, which is actually a jQuery wrapped element, and the attributes that are on that element. The last thing we need to do before we get started is head to our app.js and take this new module that we've created and add it to our application. So we just need to find our app.js, and we've already got a bunch of modules that we're using from the ng boilerplate stock, and we just need to add our knob module to it. Now that we've got that set up as a starting point, we can launch our web browser and see what that looks like. So we use grunt for this, so we'll type in grunt watch. and it does a bunch of tasks to build, and then launches Firefox to do some testing with Karma. We don't really need that right now. This uses Firefox by default, but it's easy enough to change it to Chrome or whatever you like. But now if we look at the log, we see that web server's been started on port 9000, hostname localhost. So we can open Chrome, which I prefer to use for my Angular development, and go to localhost port 9000. And we can see the output of the knob demo as it comes from Angular boilerplate, which we get through Human. So now let's actually put our knob into our template. First, we'll find our home.tpl.html. TPL stands for template, and we'll just take out this stuff because we don't really need it. And we're going to replace it with knob, because we declared knob as an element, so that is now a knob. Now if we push save, Chrome will automatically refresh because it's using a live reload plugin, and you'll see that it's not doing anything, but that's because our directive really doesn't have any important code in it yet. So now we'll head back to WebStorm, and we'll do the absolute simplest thing. If we look at the documentation, we'll see that the simplest thing is actually to just take the jQuery selector for an element and apply the knob method. Well, in our case, in knob.js, the EL element is actually the jQuery selector, so all we have to do is type el.knob, and when the element is sensed in the HTML, it will be compiled by Angular and replaced with the markup for the knob. So now we have our knob, and that's the default functionality. Next, I want to show you how easy it is to add attributes to our directive. If we search the documentation for foreground color, we can see that there is an easy option to add the foreground color to the knob by putting attributes inside the call to the knob method. So let's go back to our code, and let's support an attribute. Attributes on the element are available through this attributes object that's passed into the link function. So we can just expand our knob call and say foreground color is equal to attributes.foreground color. Now what Angular does for the attributes is it turns everything that's written in the HTML as dash notation into a camel case notation like this. So that means that in our HTML we can just add foreground color with dashes like this equals red, for instance. And now, when we refresh our browser, we'll see that our knob is red. Next, we want to make sure that when we change the value of the knob, that value will be persisted in our data layer. So the knob has this change function that runs whenever you change it. So we need to integrate that with our Angular directive. In order to make sure that works, let's go to our HTML, and let's add a paragraph tag with a binding to something called rating. And let's also add that to our knob as well with the directive ngModel. ngModel is how you connect directives to data. So now that we have that, we'll go into our directive, and we'll implement that change method. It passes in a value. Now what's really important to do in Angular is whenever you're doing something that Angular doesn't already know about through its dirty tracking mechanism, you need to basically let it know that that's happening through either a browser click event or something that's happening in jQuery land or something like that. And how we do that is we take the scope and we run the $apply method and we feed it a function. And this function will do a try-catch around everything we do in here, and it'll ensure that whatever changes we make inside will be applied to the data model. But first we need to integrate with that ngModel. So we will require ngModel, and that's just saying that Angular expects this directive to also have an ngModel directive, and then we can access the API provided by its controller through the fourth parameter of the link function. Now that we have ngModel, we can call ngModel.add set view value. And now, when we change our knob, we should see that the value gets updated live as well. But there's actually a bug going on right now. This is actually only a one-way binding. There's no way we can change the value and have the knob be updated right now. If we can illustrate this by going to our HTML and changing this paragraph tag to an input. Now if we refresh, we see the input there, and we can affect the input, but if we change this to 10, our knob doesn't change to match. So let's fix that next. We do this by filling in the render method for the ngModel controller. So in our directive, we do ngModel, if I could type, $render equals just a function. And from that function, we can do what we need to do to update the knob. Now if we look at our documentation, we'll see that we can set the value by taking the selector, calling .val with the value, and then triggering the change event. So let's do that within our ngModel render. And we get that value through ngModel.viewValue, trigger change. So now if we save this, we can do the one-way data binding, and we can do 10, 50, even 140, and it all just works. Now we can even have 3 of these and it won't matter. So we'll go back to the home template, and we can take this knob and replicate it 3 times, and even set the middle one to blue. And they will all stay in sync with the same number. And of course, if we change the value here, it will be affected on all 3. So that's the basics of how you create a simple directive with AngularJS. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.